The last time I saw my father, he was lying in a hospice bed in Colorado Springs, sunlight spilling softly through the blinds. His hands were calloused, scarred, and still carried the smell of pine sap, the same smell that clung to our old ranch for decades. Even in his final days, he couldn't stop talking about the cabin he built by hand, plank by plank, with nothing but a pickup truck, a pile of lumber, and more stubbornness than sense. He'd tell the same stories over and over, how he and Mom spent their honeymoon hammering the first boards together, how a blizzard once trapped them inside for 3 days, and how every single nail carried a memory. As I sat there, I realized that cabin wasn't just a place. It was his life's work, his dream, his proof that a man could carve a legacy out of nothing but dirt, sweat, and faith. When he passed, I inherited more than a piece of land. I inherited responsibility. That cabin wasn't just family property, it was sacred ground. My father always said, "Never let anyone tell you what your land's worth. You already paid for it with your life." After the funeral, I started splitting my time between my welding job in the city and weekends at the cabin. I'd drive the old truck up the gravel road, watching the trees part to reveal that same view my father cherished, the lake reflecting the sky like glass, the old pine stump where he used to sharpen his axe, the creak of the porch that still sounded like his laugh. There's a kind of peace you only find in places built by love. Every time I sat by the fireplace, I felt like he was still there, not gone, just waiting quietly in the walls. I tried to keep the place exactly how he left it. Fixed the roof, replaced a few planks, cleaned up the weeds near the dock. It wasn't much, but it felt like honoring him. But time has a way of testing what you hold dear. As the nearby town grew, so did its rules, and the land around our cabin was slowly swallowed up by development. New houses, new money, and eventually a new homeowners association. They called it Lakeside Estates. I remember the first time I saw the sign go up down the road. It looked harmless enough, white letters on green wood, promising community improvement and lake preservation. I thought nothing of it. I should have known better. My father used to joke that the real trouble doesn't come with storms or droughts. It comes wearing clipboards and smiles. He wasn't wrong. At first, I figured the HOA had nothing to do with me. After all, our cabin was built long before their fancy bylaws or lakefront rules. But standing there, watching construction trucks roll in and new fences appear where open fields used to be, something inside me twisted. I could feel change creeping in, slow, quiet, but unstoppable. Still, I told myself I'd manage. My father raised me to handle things with patience, not fists. The world could take what it wanted, but as long as that cabin stood, I'd always have a piece of him left. That was before I learned what community enforcement really meant. Back then, I thought the hardest part of losing my father was saying goodbye. I didn't realize the real battle for his legacy hadn't even begun. The first year after my father's passing was the hardest. The cabin felt different, quieter, heavier, like the walls themselves were grieving. Every creak in the floorboards sounded like his footsteps. Every whisper of the wind through the pine trees carried his voice. I tried to stay busy, the way he would have wanted. My weeks were long welding steel beams in the city during the day, then driving up to the ranch every Friday evening. The moment those city lights disappeared in my rearview mirror, I felt my shoulders loosen. It wasn't just a drive, it was a reset. A few hours to trade the noise of machines for the rhythm of crickets and the hum of the lake. Most weekends were spent alone, fixing small things that no one else would notice. A loose hinge on the porch door, a leak under the kitchen sink, rotting boards on the dock. Every task felt like a conversation with him, one I wasn't ready to end. Sometimes, I'd pour 2 cups of coffee in the morning out of habit. One for me, one for him. I wasn't rich. The welding work paid the bills, but barely. Still, I refused to sell the land. People in town made offers, some generous, some insulting, but the answer was always the same. Not for sale. You can't put a price on something that holds your father's fingerprints. The loneliness hit hardest on Sundays. That's when the families from the new development started showing up: shiny trucks, jet skis, kids in matching swimsuits. They looked at my old cabin like it was some relic from the past, out of place among their modern lake houses. I could see it in their eyes, the way they'd glance over with polite smiles that didn't reach their faces. But I didn't mind. I wasn't there for them. I was there to keep the promise I made to my father to protect the land he built with his bare hands. One evening, I was patching the fence when a woman I'd never seen before walked up the gravel drive. Expensive sunglasses, clipboard in hand. She smiled like she was doing me a favor just by standing there. "Afternoon," she said. "You must be the owner of this property?" "Been in my family 60 years, I replied, wiping the sweat off my hands. "Oh, how wonderful," she said, her tone sugary sweet. "I'm Karen. I'm the new president of the Lakeside Estates Homeowners Association." I remember pausing, not out of fear, just confusion. "Homeowners, what?" Her smile didn't waver. "The HOA. We oversee all properties along this part of the lake. You should have received a letter about membership and compliance requirements." I hadn't received anything, or at least nothing that made sense. But the way she said oversee made something inside me bristle. I told her politely that our cabin had been here long before her HOA existed. She nodded like she understood, but I could tell by her eyes she didn't care. She handed me a packet of papers and said, "We'll just need a few signatures to make everything official. It's all standard procedure." Then she turned and walked away before I could even respond. When I opened the packet later that night, I realized nothing about it was standard. It was the first of many reminders that I wasn't just maintaining a cabin anymore, I was guarding a battlefield. 2 weeks after Karen's visit, I came home from the city to find a bright orange envelope taped to my cabin door. It was impossible to miss bold letters at the top, read NOT, ICEOFNONCOMPLIAENCE. My first thought was that it had to be a mistake. The cabin sat on family land long before the HOA ever existed. How could they possibly have authority here? Still, I took the letter inside, poured myself a cup of coffee, and sat down at my father's old desk, the one carved from a single pine log. As I unfolded the papers, a sour feeling started creeping up my chest. Apparently, my fence height exceeded community regulations. My dock construction did not meet HOA design standards. And worst of all, my residence failed to maintain uniform appearance with surrounding properties. That last line hit me the hardest. Uniform appearance. The cabin wasn't built to be uniform. It was built to be real. Every board was different, every wall slightly uneven, because that's what happens when something is made by hand, not by a contractor. The letter demanded immediate corrective action and listed potential fines for non-compliance, hundreds of dollars per week. At first, I laughed. Surely this was some clerical mix-up. Maybe they sent the wrong address. I called the number listed at the bottom, expecting to clear it up in a few minutes. When Karen answered, that same sugary tone dripped through the phone. "Oh, yes," she said. "We've been meaning to discuss your property. It's quite unique." "Unique," I repeated slowly. "It's my family home." "Yes, but you understand, mister?" She paused, pretending to check her notes. "Matthews," I said. "Mr. Matthews, we're simply ensuring that all residents maintain the integrity of the lakeside community. It's for everyone's benefit." I told her, as calmly as I could, that the cabin wasn't part of her HOA and never would be. There was a pause. Then her voice sharpened, just a little. "Well," she said, "our jurisdiction covers all properties along the lakefront. If your home falls within those boundaries, you're automatically included. It's all in the bylaws. I'd be happy to send another copy. She hung up before I could reply. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring at the silent phone. The lake outside was perfectly still, the kind of calm that usually brought peace, but this time, it felt eerie, like the water itself knew a storm was coming. Over the next few days, more letters arrived, each one more aggressive than the last. First, it was a warning, then a fine, then threats of legal action. I tried reasoning with them. Sent copies of the original deed showing our property line, proving the cabin predated their development by decades. No response. One morning, I drove into town to check the county property records myself, just to be sure. When I saw that the HOA had quietly updated the map to include my lot inside their jurisdiction, I felt my stomach drop. It wasn't a mistake. It was a move. That night, I sat by the fire, staring at the orange envelopes stacked on the table. They weren't just paper, they were a challenge. A declaration of war against everything my father built. And deep down, I knew this wasn't going to stop with letters. Calls. Instead, her secretary told me everything had to go through formal channels. When I asked what that meant, she said, "You'll need to submit a request for hearing to the compliance committee." I laughed out loud. "I don't belong to your committee." Her voice went cold. "That's for the committee to decide." The next week, I came up to the cabin and found something worse. The padlock on my boathouse had been cut. Tools scattered, fishing gear missing. I filed a police report, but the deputy shrugged. "Looks like vandalism," he said. "Can't prove who did it." But I knew. See, the HOA wasn't just trying to find me, they were trying to break me. To make the cabin feel like a burden instead of a home. It's how they work. Death by 1,000 paper cuts. A few of the new neighbors even started avoiding me. Word spreads fast when people like Karen start whispering. Suddenly, I was the stubborn old holdout who wouldn't play by the rules. Kids stopped waving when they rode by on their bikes. One couple even told me I was hurting property values. The irony was painful. My cabin was the oldest structure on the entire lake. Without it, half of those property lines wouldn't even exist. One evening, I drove past the HOA office downtown, a small building tucked between a bank and a nail salon. Through the glass, I could see Karen and 2 other board members sitting around a table, laughing over coffee. On the wall behind them hung a framed map of the lake. My property was marked in red. That was the moment something shifted inside me. Up until then, I'd been patient, respectful even. I figured reason would win out, that people couldn't possibly be this petty. But as I stood there in the dark, looking through that window, I realized reason had nothing to do with it. This was about control, power, and I'd been giving them both by staying quiet. So I stopped being quiet. The next morning, I called a friend in the county records office and asked him to dig up every document tied to the HOA's creation. Charter filings, land deeds, jurisdiction maps, all of it. What I found confirmed what I'd suspected. The HOA had overstepped their boundaries, legally and literally. But I didn't confront them right away. No, I decided to wait, to let them keep digging their own hole while I gathered every piece of proof I needed. Because if there's one thing my father taught me, it's this: you don't pick fights, but if someone brings one to your doorstep, you make sure they regret it. And I had every intention of doing exactly that. The first time I met Karen in person, she didn't introduce herself. I was out by the mailbox, an old rusted thing my dad had cemented into the ground sometime in the late 70s. I was repainting the post, trying to keep the last bit of his handiwork from fading. That's when a white Lexus SUV pulled up beside me. The window rolled down, and a woman with perfect blonde curls and oversized sunglasses leaned out, smiling like she'd rehearsed it. "You must be Garrett," she said, pronouncing it like it was a disease. "I'm Karen McIntyre, president of the Sage Valley Homeowners Association. We've been trying to reach you." She didn't offer a handshake. She just stared, pen tapping against a clipboard. I wiped my hands on a rag and nodded. "Yeah, I got your letters." "All 12 of them." Her smile tightened. "Well, that's wonderful. Then you know why I'm here." "I've got a pretty good guess," I said, glancing toward my property. "But let's hear it from you." I took a deep breath. "That's a fancy word for demolition, isn't it?" She smiled again. "Let's not get dramatic. We simply want to bring your property up to standard." "Lady," I said quietly, "this cabin was here before any of your houses existed. Your standards don't apply to me." That cracked the smile. "Oh, Garrett, you're mistaken. The HOA's jurisdiction includes all adjacent properties within our established easement zone. It's about community consistency. Surely you want to maintain property values?" I leaned against the mailbox, pretending to think. Funny thing about property values. They don't mean much when your name's on the deed and your land's already paid for. Karen's lips twitched. "You'll find that's not quite how things work around here. The board has considerable influence with the county planning department. We can make life very complicated for non-compliant property owners." Her tone was sweet as sugar, but her eyes were pure venom. I smiled right back. "Is that a threat, Mrs. McIntyre?" "Oh, heavens no," she said, still smiling. "Just neighborly advice." Then she rolled her window up, and the Lexus glided away quiet, polished, and smug. That night, I sat in my father's old study, staring at the collection of county maps he'd left behind. One was marked with the original broken antler boundary lines, signed and dated 1959. Another showed the more recent subdivision map, the one where the HOA had conveniently extended their limits by nearly 40 yards. And right there, in bold marker, was the proof. They'd included my creek, my pasture, and part of my northern fence line inside their HOA zone. Karen hadn't just bent the rules. She'd rewritten them. The next day, I went down to the county records office. Ruth, the clerk, had been there for decades. She'd known my dad. When I showed her the map, she frowned. "Oh, they've been trying that trick for years," she said. "They refile maps every few seasons, hoping no one notices. But jurisdictional changes require county approval, and there's no record of that ever being granted." "Can I get a certified copy?" I asked. $12, she said, stamping the papers. "Best $12 you'll ever spend." I walked out of that office with a folder full of proof and a slow-burning fire in my chest. Karen might have thought she could bully me into submission, but she just made her biggest mistake. She made me care. Because once I care, I don't stop. And by the time this was over, Karen McIntyre was going to wish she'd never set foot on Broken Antler land. Karen didn't go quietly. She started with the HOA board storming into meetings, waving letters, shouting about abuse of power, and unlawful interference. She called me a tyrant, a fraud, a man who used his badge to play God. But every time she tried to build a case, the same truth crushed her arguments. She had broken the law, and I hadn't. When she called the local news station, they ran her story at first. She sat in front of the camera, trembling, wearing pearls and tears, painting herself as the victim of a cruel judge with a vendetta. That night, my phone buzzed with messages from reporters. I sent them one PDF. Just one. Inside it were the drone photos of her unapproved demolitions, the invoices she forged, and a written statement from the county engineer confirming she falsified a safety permit. By morning, the story flipped. Karen wasn't the victim anymore. She was the HOA president accused of fraud and property destruction. Her face was plastered across the local headlines, not as a crusader, but as a cautionary tale. When she showed up at my gate days later, she wasn't screaming this time. She was shaking. "You destroyed me," she whispered. "All I ever wanted was control. To keep this place clean, safe." I looked at her, the same woman who tried to erase my father's legacy from the map, and said, "You could have asked for peace. But you chose power." She didn't answer, just turned and drove away. A month later, the county sheriff's office processed her eviction notice. The same one I had signed legally through due process. The same property she had once used as her HOA fortress was now sold at auction to cover the debts she racked up during her fight. When the bulldozers arrived, not to destroy my cabin, but to tear down hers, I stood by the porch my father built, coffee in hand, and watched the sun rise over the lake. It wasn't revenge I felt, not victory, just silence. The kind of silence you earn after standing your ground through the storm. The day after Karen's house came down, I walked the property lines like my father used to. Every fence post, every ridge, every tree had a memory. His handwriting was still carved into the underside of the porch rail for the stubborn ones who don't give up. For years, I thought this land was just dirt and wood. But standing there, hearing the echo of the bulldozers fade into the hills, I realized it was a promise. A promise that some things aren't meant to be tamed by paperwork or pride. The neighbors stopped by over the following weeks. Quiet nods. Some shook my hand. A few apologized for staying silent when the HOA chaos unfolded. I didn't blame them. Fear makes people small. But one moment stood out. An older man, Mr. Coleman, who'd lived down the road since before the HOA existed, handed me a small box. Inside was a photo of him and my dad pouring the first post together back in the 70s. "Your old man kept this place alive when no one else cared," he said. "Glad to see it's in the right hands again." That night, I rebuilt the mailbox myself, the same one Karen had ordered torn down. I painted it the same weathered red my father loved and bolted the sign that read Carter Ranch established 1972. The next morning, when the sun rose across the lake, it wasn't just light hitting water, it was history breathing again. The air smelled like pine and rain and forgiveness. For the first time in decades, I felt like my father could rest. His stories, his sweat, his stubborn heart all still here. And the cabin, scarred but standing, was proof that legacy doesn't belong to the loudest voice or the fanciest title. It belongs to those who endure. So when people ask what happened to the HOA, I just smile and say, it dissolved like mist over the lake. And if you drive by Carter Ranch today, you won't see fences or warning signs, just a weathered porch light glowing at dusk and a chair rocking in the breeze. Because peace doesn't need to shout. It just needs to stay standing. Sometimes, late in the evening, I sit on that old porch swing with the same thermos my father used to carry. The lake is quiet now. No HOA meetings. No arguments about paint shades or lawn edges. Just wind in the pines, water lapping against the dock, and the steady rhythm of peace. It's strange how places remember. The lake still reflects the sky the way it did 50 years ago. The boards of the cabin still creak in the same places. Even the old screen door sings the same weary squeak when I step outside. But it's not the same me walking through it anymore. I used to think justice was about winning, about proving someone wrong. But the truth is, justice is quieter. It's not in the headlines or the gavel drops. It's in the small victories, the right to rebuild what was yours, the freedom to live without fear of someone trying to control it. Karen's name doesn't come up much anymore. The lot where her house once stood has turned into wild grass and daisies. Nature has a way of erasing arrogance and restoring balance. And in that silence, there's something almost poetic, like the land itself forgave her long before I did. Every now and then, I see a family stop by the lake's edge, maybe new residents or travelers passing through. They look at the water, take a deep breath, and smile. They don't know what happened here, the fights, the threats, the long nights of standing guard over something sacred. They just see beauty. And maybe that's how it should be. Because the story of this place was never really about Karen, or the HOA, or even revenge. It was about endurance. About a man who refused to let history be bulldozed by ego. About a father's dream that outlasted greed, gossip, and time itself. When I close my eyes, I can still hear him, that gravelly laugh, that old country wisdom. He used to say, "Land don't belong to you, boy. You belong to the land. Treat it right, and it'll remember your name." And as the sun sets behind the ridge, casting the cabin in gold, I realize it does remember. It remembers him. It remembers me. And it remembers that no matter how many people try to own the view, the horizon will always belong to those who earned it. The lake glimmers one last time before the evening swallows the light. I take a sip of coffee, smile to the quiet, and whisper, "Welcome home, Dad. We did it." There's a kind of silence that only comes after years of noise. After the shouting, the meetings, the threats, the endless letters stuffed with rules. When it's all gone, what's left isn't emptiness. It's peace. That's what the lake sounds like now. Not victory, just release. The water doesn't remember the arguments. The trees don't recall who signed what papers. They just keep standing like they always have, whispering the same truth. That time humbles everyone, and nature forgives more than people ever will. Sometimes I think about how close I came to walking away. How easy it would have been to sell the land, leave the cabin, and let Karen win by exhaustion. But then I remember what my father taught me. Don't let temporary people rewrite permanent stories. He built this place with calloused hands and quiet pride, and I like to believe that somewhere, he's sitting on a porch of his own, looking down, smiling at what's still standing. The HOA? It's gone. The board dissolved, the files boxed away, the bylaws buried under dust in some county storage room. But the land endures. It holds the echoes of laughter, of hammer strikes, of the stubborn heartbeat that kept it alive. And me? I've stopped fighting ghosts. Now, I just wake up to the same sunrise my father did, watch the same lake glow, and know that sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction. It's preservation. Because, in the end, peace doesn't come from tearing others down. It comes from rebuilding what they tried to destroy. The world moves on. But this place, this porch, this lake, this story, stays exactly where it belongs. If there's one thing this land has taught me, it's that time has its own justice. It doesn't need courts or signatures. It waits, and in waiting, it reveals who was right all along. When you live close to the earth, you learn patience the hard way. Storms come, fences fall, people lie, neighbors change, but the ground stays. And maybe that's why my father built this cabin here, on the edge of the lake, where the world slows down enough for truth to breathe. Karen spent her life trying to control things that were never hers. Rules, power, image, all of it faded like footprints in the mud after rain. But what lasts isn't control. It's care. It's kindness. It's the quiet strength of someone who refuses to give up on what matters, even when no one else believes it's worth fighting for. Now, when I hear the water tapping against the dock, it doesn't sound like memory anymore. It sounds like gratitude. For the lessons, the losses, and the long nights it took to understand that peace isn't something you find, it's something you build. Maybe that's what my father meant when he said, "Legacy isn't land, son. It's what you leave standing when you're gone. And here, on this lake, with the cabin still strong, the porch light still glowing, and the world finally quiet, I think I finally understand. The land doesn't just remember us, it forgives us. And if we listen closely enough, it teaches us how to begin again. The sun always sets the same way here, slow, deliberate, like it knows the weight of what this place has seen. Each evening, the light drifts across the water, touches the porch rail, and then disappears behind the ridge. But just before it's gone, it glows one last golden shimmer over the lake. That's the part I wait for. Because in that brief moment, the whole world feels still. No grudges, no board meetings, no noise, just that soft reminder that even the hardest days end with light. I think about my father when I see it. How he used to sit right here, boots kicked up, eyes half closed, saying, "Son, the world will always test you. But if you can look out at that horizon and still feel peace, you've already won." He was right. Peace isn't loud. It's not about who got the last word or who stood tallest in the end. It's about sitting quietly after the storm, knowing you did what was right, even when no one clapped for it. The lake is calm now. The porch creaks with the evening wind. Somewhere, an old owl calls from the trees, and the sound fades into the hum of the night. I take one last sip of coffee and let the silence settle. The cabin stands, the land breathes, and the story rests. Everything's back where it belongs. So if you've been fighting your own version of Karen, your own storm, your own battle for peace, remember this: sometimes the best revenge isn't fire or fury or noise. Sometimes it's just enduring. Because when the dust settles and the sun sets and the lake quiets down, the only thing that matters is what still stands. The light fades. The screen darkens. And the lake, once again, keeps the secret. If you've stayed with me until now, through every battle, every silence, every sunrise over this lake, then maybe you understand something most people never will. This story wasn't just about land. It was about the fight to keep something pure when the world keeps trying to claim it. About holding on when everyone tells you to let go. About standing your ground, not for pride, but for peace. Because in the end, that's all any of us really want, isn't it? A place that's ours. A corner of the world that remembers who we are when everything else tries to forget. If you've ever been underestimated, pushed out, or told you don't belong, let this story remind you you do. You always have. You just have to keep standing long enough for the noise to fade. And when it does, you'll hear it the same sound I hear now. The water, calm again. The wind through the pines. A world that's moved on, but somehow left you standing exactly where you're meant to be. So wherever you are, hold on to your peace. Protect what's worth keeping. And never let anyone bulldoze the ground your story was built on. Because one day, when the storm passes, you'll look out across your own quiet lake and realize you didn't just survive, you endured. And that, my friend, is how legacies are born. If this story stayed with you, don't forget to leave a like, share your thoughts below, and subscribe to hear more stories like this one. Because here, we don't just tell tales. We remember what they teach. The world quiets when stories end. Not because they're forgotten, but because they finally said everything they needed to say. The cabin still stands where it always has, roots deep in the same soil that carried generations of voices. The lake still mirrors the sky, unchanged, unbothered by the noise that once filled its shores. Somewhere out there, someone new will build, someone else will fight, and the cycle will start again, people chasing control, others just trying to hold on to what matters. But maybe, just maybe, they'll hear echoes of this place in the wind. Because stories like this don't really end. They ripple across time, across hearts, across quiet evenings. When someone sits down, stares at the horizon, and finally understands what it means to endure. If you've made it this far, let the stillness of this moment be your reminder. Not every battle is meant to be loud, and not every victory needs to be seen. Sometimes, the truest kind of strength is just surviving long enough to watch peace return. The screen fades to black. The lake glows one last time. And somewhere in that soft reflection, the story rests not as an ending, but as a promise. A promise that what's built with heart can never truly be destroyed.